Since I was a child, and honestly, actually, since before I was born, people have been talking about the fact that China is soon going to attack and capture Taiwan. And this is something that comes up from time to time, and every time it comes up, people are always extremely worried about it. And they're worried about it for good reason. If China were actually to attack Taiwan, it is a huge event that sort of captures the imagination. Probably a World War III scale type event because of all of the ramifications. It's not just about China having a territorial dispute with a nearby country that it claims has territory that is actually its own territory, but it's also become a worldwide global matter of strategic importance because Taiwan is the only place on the planet that can produce most of the semiconductors that we now rely on for everyday life. We're not just talking about cell phones and computer chips. We're actually talking about the technology that runs pretty much everything in modern society. From vehicles to airplanes to farm equipment, you get the picture. If China were actually to attack Taiwan, it would be huge and potentially could even escalate into nuclear war in a worst case scenario. And since Russia has invaded Ukraine, obviously a lot of people have been worried that China attacking Taiwan might be the next step. However, as I've been studying the conversations that have been going on all over the place about Taiwan, what I've noticed is a theme where most people miss what, to my mind, are the most important aspects of the entire conversation. The most important strategic details that make it rather clear that China probably actually would not attack Taiwan anytime in the near future. And even if they would, even if they were willing to do so, they would not have the capability to do so. And this isn't based on rhetoric or subjective analysis of Xi Jinping's personal psychology, but it's actually based on the hard data and the strategic facts, the things that China would need that they simply don't have to actually carry out an invasion of this scale. First and foremost, there's a critical question that nobody seems to be asking, but that we really should be asking now that China has been threatening to take Taiwan for several decades, and yet they never have. And that question is, what has prevented China from attacking Taiwan in the past? And when we look at those details, have those things significantly changed to the point that China would actually attack Taiwan today? And it's a very important question because indeed China has been threatening this for a long time. It's clearly something that they would do if they could, and if they could do so at a realistic cost. And yet it's also clear that for decades China has decided that it's not something they're capable of doing. And the reality is that when you look at the world today, it is still something that China is incapable of doing. That is true for several different reasons. It's true for geopolitical reasons that have not yet sufficiently changed in China's favor. It's true for basic resource realities that China still has not shored up. And in fact, you could argue these things have only become greater vulnerabilities for China as it is industrialized more. And it's also true for internal cohesion realities, the reality that China probably can't risk a full-scale war with external opponents because of how internally unstable China is as a whole and how much attention China needs to put on its internal politics in order to keep things functioning, which for the Chinese Communist Party is their number one priority. Not external conquests, but internal control. External conquests are nice if they can have both, but if they have to choose between one or the other, it's very clear that they are always going to choose between internal control. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to analyze all of these things in depth so that hopefully you can see things as clearly as I do, and I'll also be layering on a lot of additional context so that you can see the true likelihood of China actually invading Taiwan versus other geopolitical objectives. And one of the core theses that I'm going to have in this video is that for China, it benefits them a lot for their primary goals, which is internal politics, to threaten an invasion of Taiwan. But threatening the invasion benefits China a whole lot more than actually carrying out the invasion. Threatening gets them benefits that they reap on a continuous basis, whereas actually carrying out the invasion, when we actually look at everything, it would only result in costs for China, which is a good explanation for why China has threatened this for such a long time, and they've never carried it out, similar to how Vladimir Putin has threatened nuclear war for a long time, but he's never actually carried it out because the threat brings the benefit, but the actual action only brings costs. And speaking of Vladimir Putin, as we dive into the analysis, I should bring up one point of further context that really hammers all of these ideas home, which is the current context of the world. Far from making it more likely that China would actually invade Taiwan, I would argue makes it less likely that China would do so, and that has to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, this could have gone one or the other direction. It could have gone in the direction of making China less likely to attack Taiwan, or it could have made China more likely, depending on how that war went. And as we have seen the war progress, I would argue it makes a very clear case for China being less likely to attack Taiwan. Because even though this war is not resolved yet, what China has seen very clearly is how effectively a much smaller country with defensive advantages, using modern technology like drones, can defend against a much larger opponent. And as you'll see, that is something that absolutely applies to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which would have to be a naval invasion, which comes with so many different challenges that Taiwan can overcome with modern technology, nullifying a lot of the advantages that China has that originate from China's large size. So that being said, we should lay out the challenges for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan to show how difficult this objective really is, because that is part of, again, the understanding of why China hasn't done it yet. And when we look at that, we can again see that not only have these challenges not become lesser for China, making them more likely to attack, but actually with each passing year, the challenges become greater and greater and greater, making China's chances of success much smaller. And the primary challenges just come down to the fact, again, that this is a naval invasion. But not only is it a naval invasion, it is a naval invasion of a country with a very particular geography. And that particular geography means that when China attacks Taiwan, there's actually only a limited number of beaches for them to choose from in the first place when it comes to actually landing there. That becomes a problem because Taiwan already knows what parts of its island it needs to fortify, and that makes any invasion that China does, it puts China at the disadvantage from the forefront, where they can only defeat Taiwan with overwhelming numbers. At first, that might seem okay for China because they have such a large country, but it gets a little bit more complex than that. Not only is Taiwan a small country with limited places that China could actually land, but the math here works against China in a way that did not apply in the last major land invasion we saw of this scale, which was, of course, D-Day in World War II. In D-Day in World War II, one of the main reasons the Allies were successful, there are a lot of reasons, but some of the main reasons were that the Allies were capable of mass deception, leading the Germans in a different direction from where they were actually planning to attack. The Germans also had a massive coastline that they had to defend, and so they had to stretch their resources rather thinly across a large area, and even as they did that, the Allies deceived them, and they were able to land in an area where Germany was not quite as prepared. In fact, a lot of German troops were deployed to a different area just before the invasion, and that gave the Allies a lot of advantages as they landed and allowed them to successfully take the objective at a far lower cost than they otherwise would have. A lot of this was possible not just because of the large amount of territory that Germany had to defend, but it was also possible because the technological era the world was in at that point was far different from the technological era the world is in today. Today, the world obviously has satellites. We have a lot of different ways of collecting military intelligence. And all of this means that if China were to actually make a move against Taiwan, Taiwan would know instantly the moment that Chinese ships left the Chinese coast, and Taiwan would be able to start retaliating immediately. They'd be able to retaliate immediately using long-range surface-to-sea missiles, other air-to-sea missiles, all kinds of missiles that could attack ocean-going targets that would allow Taiwan to take out a large percentage of China's ships before they even approach the shore in the first place. And there are many other factors at play. For example, in D-Day, the Allies were able to also parachute troops behind the German lines as well as their naval invasion. And that allowed them to kind of have two-pronged approaches, and that made the campaign a lot more successful. And that is also something that China would likely be unable to do on Taiwan effectively because, again, modern technology, Taiwan now has anti-aircraft missiles and they have a rather small island. And assuming that they can accumulate enough anti-aircraft missiles, they can effectively prevent the Chinese from getting behind their lines in that way. And so from the forefront, this is a very costly objective that because of the situation of modern technology, is going to be very difficult for China to actually achieve, despite the fact that Taiwan is much smaller. Because if Taiwan can deny Chinese troops the opportunity from ever landing in the first place, or at least a large portion of Chinese troops, China's large size really never comes into play. Now, all of this starts to look even better for Taiwan when you consider the actual level of capability that China has when it comes to landing troops on Taiwanese territory, because the scenario that I've just proposed sort of implicitly assumes that China would have enough ships to actually keep sending waves, but that's not actually true either. Currently, China's capacity when it comes to amphibious landing vessels is to land about 25,000 troops in a best case scenario, 25,000 troops in a single wave. And that's a number of troops that it seems Taiwan would be rather easily able to handle all at one go. And remember, this is China's entire capacity. It's not like if this wave gets defeated, they can just send the next wave, because this is China's capacity of amphibious landing ships, which means whatever gets destroyed in that first wave is not coming back for the second wave. And so each wave would progressively get smaller, not larger, as China tried to attack Taiwan. In fact, as most war games have looked at this scenario, they have decided that China would likely need somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 troops to actually land on Taiwan to have a chance of being successful. And keep in mind, this is just a chance of being successful at the initial landing. It's not talking about the long-term war, where after China successfully landed on Taiwanese territory, they would actually need to logistically sustain all of this. They would need to keep their troops supplied, which means that China never really can fully take the entire sea route and just continually safely send supplies to its troops. Throughout this entire conflict, China is going to be getting sustained pressure on its supply lines, which means that even if they are able to take the beachhead, which they currently do not have enough capacity for, they probably aren't going to be able to sustain that, and Taiwan can probably overwhelm the Chinese landing force in a war of attrition over time. And again, that's true even though Taiwan is much smaller than China, because as we've learned in Ukraine, it's not really about the size of the country. That plays in a little bit. But if your troops can defeat the troops that your enemy can muster at every given point because of your defensive advantages, the size only matters so much. And that's especially true in a seaborne invasion, where unlike a continental war, you can kind of easily move around a lot of troops, whereas in a seaborne invasion, you're very limited by your actual number of ships. And so far, all I've been talking about is as if Taiwan would be engaging in this war all on its own by itself. And that seems unlikely. If China were to actually attack Taiwan, there's a very good chance the United States would be involved. And even if the United States itself was not involved, Taiwan has other allies in and around them in the South China Sea who are not very happy with China. And if China made a move this aggressive, there's a chance that other countries like the Philippines or Vietnam or even Japan or South Korea, I know they're not in the South China Sea, I'm just listing them as well, would actually get involved to help Taiwan. And these are all naval powers who would have the precise capabilities needed, again, to stop Chinese supply lines from being successful in delivering ammunition, food, etc. to the troops on Taiwan. All of this turns out to be incredibly important, again, because of the precedent that we've actually seen in the modern world, which is not speculation, it's actual data. When it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine, we've already seen how in a war of attrition, Ukraine has effectively ground down Russia's most important equipment over time, and because of that, Russia has been reduced to progressing very slowly, and most people think Russia is not actually capable of ultimately achieving its objectives. At best, maybe they could capture and keep a slice of Ukraine. Over time, Ukraine has been able to take out more tanks, more armored vehicles than Russia has been able to replace. And it would be similar for Taiwan, but not with tanks and armored vehicles, but rather with landing craft and other types of seagoing vessels. It's a big problem for China because currently they don't have enough capacity, as I've said, and they're not actually building enough capacity to make this possible. Currently, China is, yes, they're producing landing craft, and this always makes the news headlines, but people almost never quantify the significance of that landing craft, which is almost zero. Because at most, China might produce a couple dozen large landing craft and a couple dozen smaller landing craft every single year. And so if that's what they can do on an annual basis, that's something that could literally be decimated in just a couple of hours in actual combat. And if that's the rate at which China can produce these things, they're not going to be able to keep producing them at a fast enough clip to keep up with, the pace of war. And that doesn't even account for the fact that you would also need to have crews that are trained in all of these things. And you can't replace crews very quickly. China, if they were going to attack Taiwan, they would need a very large, redundant supply of troops that were pre-trained on all of the systems. And they just don't have that. They don't have that today. So with all of this in mind, it is militarily impossible for China to attack and keep Taiwan anytime in the near future. That might sound like a surprise to some because you might have heard some estimates, especially in news headlines, that will often say China is prepared to attack Taiwan by the year 2025 or 2027. It depends on when you read the headlines. I'm sure if you were to go far enough back, somebody would have said they could do it by 2010, and then somebody would have said they could do it by 2015, and it just keeps getting pushed back. Why are you hearing these numbers? Well, typically these numbers come from, for example, statements from Xi Jinping, where most recently he made a statement that basically directed China to be prepared to attack and take Taiwan by the year 2027. And so people will say Xi Jinping has made this statement, and so that's what we need to be prepared for. But despite the fact that Xi Jinping has made this statement, the actual military realities haven't followed. And so people look at these statements, and that's where a lot of these headlines come from. People are very rarely examining the true realities of military hardware and things like that. And again, as we've seen in the war in Ukraine, those are the things that matter a whole lot more than the directives that come from the top. Putin can tell the Russian military to take Ukraine tomorrow all he wants. It doesn't matter because the Russian military is incapable of doing that, and that's why they haven't done so yet. Now, you might think the discussion so far has already put the nail in the coffin, and indeed it actually has. We could stop the discussion there, and that would be a sufficient case. But we're just getting started. There's a whole lot more data here to support this argument even more. It's not just one-off speculation, once again, but it's based on hard data. Because of all of this, a lot of people have determined, a Chinese actual land-based amphibious invasion of Taiwan is impossible, but that doesn't mean China can't use other strategies to attack Taiwan. And one of the big things that comes up a lot is a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan. This is something that people are really worried about. And yes, I would admit it is a bigger threat than a Chinese amphibious assault of Taiwan because it's a lot more achievable. China could lock down the sea around Taiwan, and they could essentially starve Taiwan out over time. However, I still don't think that's likely, not likely at all, because what a lot of people forget in this scenario is that if China does this, China is just as vulnerable to blockade as Taiwan is. Yes, Taiwan would undergo a lot of damage in this scenario, but China would ultimately still lose. And that's because of something that not a lot of people don't realize. And that's that China is heavily dependent on energy imports of coal and imports of oil in order to keep their economy running. And that's super important because China's main advantage that people always talk about is that China has this massive industrial capacity and they have access to all these rare earth metals and things like that. And so China could outlast the West in a war. But what people forget about is in order to run your industrial capacity, you need energy. And if you don't have energy, industrial capacity is just a bunch of empty buildings that are useless. And for China in particular, their energy trade routes are very vulnerable to blockade because most of their energy has to pass through something that's called the Straits of Malacca, which is very easy to close off, and there's various other choke points. And so when we look at China, if they were to blockade Taiwan, they would instantly get blockaded at the Straits of Malacca. They would lose the energy they need for a sustained war. And people might say, well, China could fight that blockade, but how is China, with their small navy, going to fight a blockade at the Straits of Malacca while simultaneously carrying out a blockade of Taiwan? They're not capable of doing both things. It would spread them far too thinly. Now, China does have other options to get some energy, but it's not enough. For example, they have some pipelines to Siberia and Russia, but that energy is not nearly enough for all of China's capacity. It's only a small drop in the bucket. China has also developed, for example, railroads that bypass the Straits of Malacca, and this goes through Pakistan, and there's ports there where they could load energy into those ports. Of course, those ports would also be subject to blockade rather easily, but even if they weren't, these railroads still couldn't deliver enough energy to China, not nearly as much as they get under the current scenario. And so China cannot effectively use the amphibious assault attack on Taiwan. They're not prepared for it. They cannot effectively use the blockade tactic against Taiwan. They're not prepared for it. In either scenario, China loses. And people might say, well, China might just be crazy enough to attack anyways. Maybe, maybe not. Remember, China has been talking about attacking Taiwan for decades, and they haven't done it yet. There is a reason they haven't done it yet. We have to ask what that reason is, and we have to ask whether that reason has changed. And these are the main reasons. It's a very difficult objective, and those underlying reasons have not changed. Now, these are all the reasons that the objective itself is difficult from a military perspective, but there's also internal reasons to China itself why such an objective might be impossible. And it goes to the challenges that China is currently facing, which, if you haven't been paying attention, China is internally not doing very well. They're not doing very well from an economic standpoint. They're not doing very well from a demographic standpoint. And China also has huge land borders that they have to continue defending under any circumstances, especially if they attack Taiwan. So from a demographic perspective, everybody knows that China had this one-child policy for a very long time because they were so overpopulated, but that's kind of whiplashed, and now they are having the opposite effect, where China's population is rapidly declining. And even the population they have, a lot of families, because of the one-child policy, they only have one son, which means in a military scenario, if you start sending the only son in a family to combat and that son dies, that's not just a sad thing for your society. It is a destabilizing event, especially in a culture like China, where often, rather than traditional retirement, you have a culture which is actually rather respectable, where the younger generations help take care of their aging parents. It's not a bad thing inherently, but it's a terrible thing to do to your country to go to war with that type of situation, because once you take those young men out of the equation, all of your old people at home, who is going to take care of them? That is a huge internal stability problem. And that starts to occur, again, while your country is at war, but it also occurs in the context of China, which is having huge economic problems right now, where they have this ballooning national debt that is a little bit smaller than the US's national debt as a percentage of GDP. But the US has a reserve currency and China doesn't, and I have an entire video explaining the significance of that. China just can't afford to go to war and keep people internally happy, even at kind of a subsistence level. They can't do both objectives at the same time. That's obviously a big deal for China, because China for a long time has had several attempts to keep internal cohesion. They always have big chunks of their society that are willing to move against them. We can think, for example, of the Hong Kong protests. We can think of the moves for Tibetan independence. We can think of China's genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. Basically, anywhere that there is a large ethnic group that China has kind of taken over their territory, these ethnic groups actually actively want to move against China, and China actively has to work against these groups rising up. And these are just the big things that we hear about outside of China. Within China, there's all sorts of internal movements that we probably never hear about. We, of course, know that there's like the underground church in China, where they're not officially allowed to meet, and China suppresses them. And so if the Chinese state were to be weakened both by external war and the internal repercussions of external war, these types of things could boil over. And it just goes on and on and on and on. What a lot of people don't know about Chinese history, too, is the reason the Chinese empire collapsed in the first place after the Opium Wars. Obviously, the Opium Wars dragged Chinese society down, but one of the reasons that Chinese society collapsed, which up to that point they had been the most powerful, most prosperous society on earth, was because due to all of these different events, kind of death by a thousand cuts, external wars and internal rebellions, China kind of lost their ability to actually pay their soldiers. And when they couldn't pay their soldiers anymore, surprise, surprise, those soldiers no longer were loyal to the state and things disintegrated kind of into chaos. It was really a bad situation. And those are the exact types of things that could and would likely happen, or at least would potentially happen, if China were to attack Taiwan. Even more than that, there are opponents around China who would look at this weakness and they would see it as their opportunity to settle long-standing grievances. And these opponents might be smaller than China, but if China was in a moment of weakness, that might be the best moment they had. And like I said, this could descend into a World War III type scenario. There's a good reason why. India in particular has territorial disputes with China, and India in the past has fought small-scale wars against China over these territorial disputes. There are other countries in Southeast Asia that have disputes with China because China tries to control all the water flowing out of the Himalayas, and they're not too happy about that because their survival literally depends on that water. And so these types of things could move against portions of China. India could move into Tibet, and they could use that to accelerate the Tibetan independence movement. Other Southeast Asian countries might see that as their opportunity to move into the southeastern part of China and again secure their control over those resources. And even if from a territorial perspective, that might seem like a small thing, these are strategically important areas of China that China doesn't want to risk losing. And so again, if they attack Taiwan, they make themselves far too vulnerable internally, but also to other external opponents, not even to mention everybody who's going to be mad at them for attacking Taiwan. Now, up to this point, what I haven't mentioned is what does China gain if they manage to succeed in Taiwan? They have all of these costs and all these potential risks, but what happens if they're successful? And the reality is, not much. Because Taiwan doesn't really have anything of value that China doesn't already have. And the main thing of value in Taiwan is the intellectual property of their people, and in particular, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation or company, I can't remember exactly which one. Basically, Taiwan's main economic offer, the main thing of strategic value, is the fact that Taiwan has semiconductor fabs, which are extremely expensive, extremely specialized, and Taiwan produces the vast majority of the world's semiconductors. But the problem for China is that if they attack Taiwan, they're not going to be able to capture any of that value, because these fabs would almost certainly be destroyed just in the process of war. And if they weren't, Taiwan would almost certainly sabotage these fabs before China was victorious so that China couldn't get anything of value from this. And China knows this. It's actually part of the deterrent strategy by Taiwan to see these kinds of ideas, which are likely true, to tell China, hey, back off because it's going to be a huge cost and you're not going to get anything of value from it. That's a huge part of the equation that a lot of people miss. And again, it's another reason why China has not attacked Taiwan up to this point, and another thing that has not changed. So with all of this in mind, if all of this is true, why would China continually threaten to attack Taiwan? And the reality comes back to this idea that for China, attacking Taiwan actually works directly against their interests, but merely threatening to attack Taiwan works for their interests. Again, there's a lot of value in the threat. There's very little value in the action. And this is something that has historically always been true of the China and the Chinese Communist Party. And that's part of why China has always threatened to attack Taiwan. Because it comes back to this national narrative, this mythology of the Chinese Communist Party, that they have rights to all of historical China. And they always have to talk about how it is their goal to one day take Taiwan back and kind of unify all of the Chinese people. And it's something that they continually have to communicate to the Chinese people. Whether it's true or not, it's something they have to communicate to the Chinese people as part of their national mythology. However, what they have learned is that they can be patient about this objective. They can keep saying they're going to take Taiwan without actually taking it, and the Chinese people won't really call their bluff. The Chinese people are being kind of patient as far as this objective goes with the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't actually have to take the objective, but they do have to continually talk about how they are preparing to take the objective. That, to my mind, is why China threatens to take Taiwan all the time. It also could be a diversion from something else that China would prefer to do, kind of a cover-up for why China is building certain military equipment. And that could be that China has a different military target in mind, one that doesn't have almost any of the downsides that Taiwan has, and has a lot more upsides, and that is China attacking Siberia, taking control of outer Manchuria territory that Russia historically took from China, and that they have long-standing grievances on. I've made entire videos on this, and so you can watch that in depth. But the long story short, is that for China to attack Siberia, first of all, they don't have nearly as many people upset with them. They also have access to more resources. It's easier to maintain because China is a continental power, not a naval power. They are not restricted by their bottleneck of amphibious vehicles. There's so many other things that make it such an easier target for China to attack. Even if they attack that target, they still have the risk of their neighbors in the south kind of using that as a moment of weakness to do their thing. But it's still a lot more feasible than Taiwan. So China could be preparing for that objective. But in either case, it does seem that it is very unlikely that China would actually attack Taiwan. That said, there is actually a legitimate threat to Taiwan where China actually has a reasonable chance of success over time, and that threat is propaganda. Where over time, China is seeking to influence the way the people on Taiwan think. China is seeking to influence their political narratives. And they also do that by influencing the political narratives in countries like ours surrounding Taiwan. And the goal around this is eventually to get Taiwan to be more pro-China, to either get them to, in a best case scenario, vote to join China, which is unlikely, or at least to split Taiwan so that there are many pro-Chinese elements there, which would make a land invasion of Taiwan potentially a lot more achievable because they would already have built-in people on the ground who might try to undermine a lot of these advantages that Taiwan has that we've mentioned earlier in the video. So the biggest threat to Taiwan isn't military. It's not even a naval blockade. It is people's minds and people being deceived by the propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. And in so many parts of the world, that is always true, whether it's Russia or China. It's the same playbook. Now, that is a large reason I do what I do on this channel. I work as hard as I can to expose people to the truth, to things that you might not hear elsewhere, because so many people are just focused on what people say on the top level news headlines. So few people dive into the actual details to see if reality matches what the headlines are implying. Headlines might imply that China is going to invade Taiwan within 2 years. Reality shows us that that is extremely, extremely unlikely, and maybe we should be worrying about different things, and that's a very important discussion to have. Now, if you've appreciated this video, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, but it helps me out a lot. And if you appreciate the approach and the work that I do here, and you've been watching for a while, do consider supporting the channel. There are a number of links in the description by which you can do so. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. Your support is really meaningful. It helps me out a lot in producing what I hope you believe are high-quality videos like this one, especially if you've watched this far. For more on China as it relates to this topic, be sure to check out one of these videos on screen.